Okay, I should not be making this recording public. I should not be uploading this recording, although I probably will because it's quite frankly embarrassing. But I haven't sat with the problem long enough to look at it in full view. But I feel that I can already anticipate the conclusion of even getting these things into focus. So yeah, the reason why this is in the first place premature is because I have not fully reverse engineered the exact correlation between metagram and metatype. And so a lot of what I'm going to get into, a lot of the speculation that I'm going to get into, and I'm pretty sure that one of these speculative lines is correct, or at least is at least self-consistent with my theory and system. Um, but essentially, this is going to look like I'm hedging my bets already, that I've kind of already failed and given up, or something like that, or no, or I'm already compromising on my initial vision. Um, that's probably the more accurate way of putting it. And um, I am coming to terms with what seems to be the higher likelihood or probability, although, as I say, I haven't that the whole point of what I was doing was I was developing two different layers, two different planes of understanding human psychology. And so it all comes down to essentially, sorry, excuse this, before completing my earlier thought, I'm just going to try to ground this in some basic context. So, my theory, the great heading of both of my headings is what is happening in patterns of thinking. What is happening in cognition? What is going on in people's cognition? And the only way to know what's going on in people's cognition, in terms of at least how I modeled my investigation, is that I had to have two separate investigations. They are interrelated in such an intimate way that there's a huge correspondence. There's some kind of interchange and overlap, and this complexity this is why psychology has not been solved, and why people, why the people who probably made the most ground in psychology were all alchemists, and why most alchemists were all alchemists always fail at the end of the day. The great work, the magnum opus, the philosopher's stone, the spiritual alchemist, or whatever, the hermetical, sort of theoreticians, they essentially they fall short. And I would still like to think that I have done better than. I don't think this is complicated, so let me not jump the gun. I'll get to how I'm framing my own effort. So I have two separate models of psychology, and you could say that the one is the model of the objects of thinking, and the other one is the model of the decider, the agent, the actor. So, if you want to understand thinking, you have to understand the thinker. You have to have a model of the thinker, and you have to have the model of the thought. So the thinker and the thought together conform to what thinking is comprised of. So if you want to understand thinker, you have to have two separate models, essentially. Now, the thinking, or the thinker and the thoughts, that you can have thoughts about the thinker. So the one is going to have the reflection of the other inculcated within it. So thoughts are going to include mechanics that involve the model of the thinker, and the thinker itself is going to have some kind of almost a priori metaphysical medium. It's going to have some kind of rubric, some kind of implicit structural, kind of so these two subject matter, or these two different, if you want to divide the topics in this way, they themselves have a fundamental, they have a different quality, they have a different nature, they have, but they also deeply intersect. They deeply, sort of they correspond in some complex way. Okay, so now I was always hoping that I would develop each of these separate models with, and this is so I don't, I was very intuitive, and I was very rigorous, and I was not trying to fudge the one according to the other, but I was, there's this is the kind of the art of the agent that drives the scientific process, which is more of an actual intellectual art than most people. If people know a little bit about the actual practice of science, as it were, but also the philosophical problems of science, and also sort of how you can't really abstract science. Science is dependent on an agent investigating and hypothesizing. There's a huge amount of creativity, and in some sense, what is good about science is somewhat being fueled from the intellect of the agent, which is quite ironically not quite respected by the scientific domain, but it's kind of the hidden hand that drives it all forward. But anyway, moving on. That when I, this is how this is how grand noble hypotheses, sort of um, insights, because all science really is, and in the original language of science, which was bastardized since the sort of the Ponzi scheme that Newton set up, the original language of science was that you were investigating the regularities of nature. It wasn't the laws of nature. It was a regularity. And what is the exact nature of this? Well, who's to say that it even is a codified set of laws? Who's to say that it's not some living, breathing, sort of organic sort of thing? Who's to say that it's something that is more ineffable, and something that is more capricious in the image of the will of inspiration and volition and self-determinism. Who's to say that that the actual nature of the deepest level of reality isn't fundamentally something like liberty itself? And so just think that you can sort of quantify and test for it rather than just denote regularities. Because who's to say that the regularity is actually a deep reading of the actual mechanism? You really have to make a lot of assumptions before you can turn regularities into universal laws. And so the kind of the mathification of reality, the reducing reality into a kind of mathematical rationalistic thing, which is which itself you can even understand philosophically has in more recent times even undermined itself if you understand Gödel's incompleteness theorem and his further extended incompleteness theorem, where you really you end up with, well, mathematics might be self-consistent. That's all you're kind of left with. Um, it's not again, what you're left with in terms of the scientific thing is in terms of the unbastardized language, is all you're left with is that maybe you can uncover regularity. Okay, so I was looking for an irregularity, and I really have to kind of I was this is how I was looking for irregularity, is that I was tending to both of these models, and I was, sort of one eye on the one model, one eye on the other model, and when I'm working on each model, I cover my other eye and pretend that it's blind, so that I'm just working on the one and then I'm just working on the other one. And in my private moments, I'm dreaming of a synthesis. I'm thinking of how these things can be. What are the angles of symmetry and congruence between these two models? And with a kind of hope that in the final development of these things, that there is going to be an uncanny alignment. There's going to that they're actually going to meet each other. They're actually going to plug into each other. That in the Newtonian idea that the puzzle pieces are going to interlock, and the last puzzle, and then I'll have the full picture. Now, it's slightly premature, and people will say maybe that I'm hedging my bets, but I probably should not be making this recording yet, but if I change my tune after this, then at least I'll have to explain this as well. But so my thinking is that these things are not going to fit together, and the the more that I've stopped myself from trying to jump towards making a grand synthesis. I have waited until each model was ripe enough, and then I've tried to imagine how these things can kind of come together. And I have also in the past already philosophized about syntheses, and I've already said I've in many of my speculations I've even said that I've essentially already laid down many tracks of saying that these things might pretty much not have a correspondence essentially, and I'm going to be summarizing those speculations somewhat in this 11th hour of how I see these things not fitting together. But this isn't this isn't a terminal defect to all my work. It's unsatisfactory because if there was an uncanny interlocking and equivalency, that means that I would have a level of internal validation and confirmation that would essentially I mean, it would be like I would have passed the sort of the there's certain things that are just kind of so technically sweet that they even if they're not true in some fully thought out way, they must they exemplify some proficiency or some it's sort of it's kind of like a crowning but there's something coherent about the structure. There's something sort of holistically coherent about it, and that maybe the interpretation then has to be refined. Now, the more that I think about how I have to characterize each of these two models independently, it makes more and more sense that these things are not going to fit together. Now, I have to even qualify that because when I say that they're not fitting together, they do fit together in a correspondence way, but they don't. There is a fixed correspondence, but I even have to philosophize about that fixed correspondence, and which will also be refined when I reverse engineer it. So I'm getting frayed at the seams here. Let me try to elaborate exactly what I mean by this. Is that I think I mean I have to be more honest, I guess, about what I'm speculating about and what I don't have confirmation and specific knowledge about. But essentially, because I took Metagram circuits and I was able to divide them into 17 distinct categories. So there are 48 Metagram circuit types that I empirically found. And then because I was able to aggregate and sort these Metagram circuits into 17 groupings, because they had similar, they had a formulaic group characteristic in they had a formulaic sort of and I don't know enough technical language to say this, but essentially there were 17 sort of formulaic. You could translate them into kind of a formulaic stylistic structure, and there were 17 of these. And because there were 17 metatypes, to me that was uncanny. So I said, okay, well, these things must naturally sort themselves into a correspondence between the metatypes and these 17 formulas. Now, those formulas, in some sense, were themselves an extraction from metatype. So there was already a kind of cross-pollination. But that particular cross-pollination and that correspondence all that does is prove that the stylistic formulaic elements that I was patterning and using to sort out metagram circuits, different metagram circuits, and group them together is just to say that when metatype is like the player or the actor or the thinker, and the metagram is like the performance or the play, or the thoughts, the pattern of thinking done by the thinker. And so it just basically means that the thing that metatype is attaching itself to is not a fixed entity in terms of metagram. It's not a metagram elemental object. It's that there is a stylistic entity or object which many metagram elements somewhat go into so it's almost as if metagram has elements that make it up, which are almost like atomic elements, and metatype is the chemist, and the chemist is only is not interested in base elements, is interested in doing interesting chemistry, and so it doesn't want to work with pure elements. It wants to work with compounds. It wants to work with chemical composites that are already, covalently bonded and have, sort of chemical properties that aren't, just kind of. That's not entirely true, because pure chemicals are sometimes bonded with themselves, depending on what phase they're in, or anyway. But and so it's just basically to say that. But I mean, and metagram itself. this analogy that I'm making is actually very problematic, because in some sense the elements in Metagram themselves are not the individual dimensions, which, they are emotional tones which are very set. But when I say that chemical compounds would be like, man, it was actually a bad. I actually would, to make an analogy, I would use more. Man, yeah, I need a richer analogy to fully make this point, but essentially that the elements that make up Metagram are even themselves interchangeable to some degree in terms of what metatype is attaching itself to. And this also opens up, so I mean, what I see myself doing now basically is that I see myself, sorry, this is one way to answer the question without finishing some of those very hard to explain things that I just raised and stupid analogies. But what I see myself doing now is developing metatype to have a final synthesized understanding of how metatype is attaching to metagram circuitry. And I can also see that this would potentially explain a lot of psychopathologies, but it would also bring, you could call it spiritual growth and development, into a much more crystallized way of contemplating, because I can already start to see a whole field of things that aren't tackled in psychology, things that people aren't sensitive to in psychology, that have to do with, essentially, I mean, I bring this up when I talk a lot about morality and politics, is, the the need for an internal locus of control, but also that one of the primary subcomponents of an internal locus of control is self-consistency. Because I do think that borderline personality disorder, for instance, actually does have an internal locus of control, but it's solipsistic because of a lack of self-consistency. So it ends up having quite a toxic form of internal locus of control, which is also almost fundamentally solipsistic. But so that's just kind of one example. But it's interesting because that same problem is is a problem that manifests in many other different psychopathologies. I mean, there is a kind of low level narcissism. Sam Bucknan will even talk about group narcissism and things like that, which I think is very much correspondent with Pierre. Man, excuse me if I get his name wrong. Girard, Pierre Girard's work on mimetic desire and scapegoating. That essentially a lot of people, they will kind of have they will have some kind of compartmentalized internal locus of control. And because they won't actually have a proper self-consistency, instead what they will do is they will have a kind of out group, or they will have, I mean, this is where bigotry generally comes from, and racism, or any kind of, sort of blaming the out group, or something like that, or trying to have some kind of collective dignity, or some kind of collective, sort of pride in your identity, or that somehow, because then you can kind of use the collective identity to solve a problem, and then you just have to keep on confabulating and disguising the inconsistency or the incongruence of that kind of position. So you're kind of gaining immortality, or you're gaining a high status, you're kind of gaining access to a secret existential stash of robustness or vigor or a kind of, it's kind of like someone has found a way to kind of patch up their death denial, sort of terror management theory kind of stuff. That they have, they've got a coping mechanism for their death denial, and so they take up uh, a kind of a narrative. They take up a story, that a mythology, and that mythology is quite embarrassing. It's got some cracks in it, but then those cracks are just scapegoated on something else. That pressure is diverted onto an external, kind of something that you can project, and so you just don't have to think about it, because and that becomes kind of the social truth, perhaps, because if you can believe that everyone that you care about agrees with you that something else doesn't matter, then you can just kind of, you can believe that your mentality, that your worldview has a kind of fundamental predominance, has a kind of uh, uh, eternity built into it. And so you've just got this pressure release valve. So you've knotted off your confabulation. You've knotted it into a convenient knot, and then you just don't think about it very much. And you just believe that everyone that you know agrees with that, or that everyone that is worth caring about, or that has ideas that are worth respecting, agrees with it, and you don't care to actually hammer it out, because it holds up your ego in the meantime. It makes you feel good in the meantime. So that's the kind of sort of collective narcissism. And I mean, this is perhaps thematically similar to mimetic desire, but maybe not exactly the exact same as mimetic desire, but almost in the converse, that, well, if you believe that other people believe that something is undesirable, then that collective standard is somewhat entrenched in a kind of in a narrative fabric, in an environmental objective narrative that you locate yourself within. And so you just locate yourself within the territory, and it just belongs to the fabric. Which, I mean, anyway, in my psychology, I link this all to the superego. This is primarily what the superego is, the environmental unconsciousness of the superego, which is the beastly conditioning of the intellect, or the self. Um, anyway, and this gives something to the ego to play off against. This gives something for anyway. But let me not get into these weeds. But the point is that this is the same thing that the borderline is doing. They're just doing it without solipsism. They're doing it collectively, because they're roping in other people. So they're roping in other people into their version or their vision of what the narrative is. And they are, in their own minds, they believe that everyone has the same pillar of the same narrative, that they share uplifting the same narrative collectively. That also connotates to slave morality in terms of Nietzsche's descriptions of these things. But so my point is that that's just another variant of what the borderline is doing. Okay, and this is happening also within Metagram circuitry. Or this is happening through Metagram circuitry. So Metagram is being abused by this. So, in some sense, my whole thing is maybe a kind of spiritual, philosophical growth and development, in terms of treating Metagram circuitry consciously interfacing through the field circuits and being responsible about, sort of your activity and use of the field circuits and emotional tones and metagram emotional tones. But anyway, so let me find my thread. So I was talking that so the thinker metatype. So yeah, I'm starting to basically think that the problem really is metatype and how metatype is attaching to metagram. Problem is on the metatype side of the equation. But you can obviously, in knowing metagram and knowing the conduits and knowing the mechanics of the field circuits, you can already get a kind of, I think, a baseline understanding of the potentiality and the spectrum of drama and human relations, but also just kind of, there's a lot of sort of latent. I do think that you could take metagram, the field circuits in metagram, and just understanding the field circuits of metagram. I think that that refined or elaborated would be the perfection of dialectical behavior therapy. I think that a lot of insight could be garnered from that, and maybe it could even be used with sort of transactional analysis and that kind of stuff. But anyway, perhaps a more structured version of those sorts of things. But anyway, so yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've heard people been listening to some lectures on YouTube and stuff, or conversations and on YouTube. Paul Vanderklay talking about. I haven't finished watching this video. I've been watching it very slowly. Um, about churches accepting marriage equality, but he talks about uh, desire being part of faith, or desire being part of the spiritual life, and it's anyway. It's just had me meditating around refining metatype. That's the thread that I was on. How I'm going to refine metatype. And really, I think it all boils down to the parent function, the inferior function, and the child function. I think that those are the three functions where all the problems are. And I think that the ground zero is, I used to say that everything that's wrong with someone, or when I talked about metatype, I used to say that it's all about the superego. That's where all the problems are. They're all in the superego. Now, I think I'm going to slightly elaborate that to say that it's actually the parent function of the ego. And I think that actually the parent function of the ego might exist before the superego. I'm starting to think that maybe the ego occurs before the superego, or at least that part of the ego precipitates the growth of the superego before going back to develop itself. So I think that the parent function in the ego grows in tandem with the superego, and that actually the parent function in the superego, which I have often referred to as the Whore of Babylon, I might have to rework some of this stuff, somewhat speculative, but I'm thinking of maybe shifting some of these things around. But it might still be that that is the Whore of Babylon. But I'm starting to think that the real problem is that it's almost like, sorry to use this phrase from Lord of the Rings, but there are two towers. There are two parent functions that you have to worry about. There's the parent function in the superego, and there's the parent function in the ego. And somehow I can't tell which one is the false prophet. I think that they might both be, but I almost think that the parent function of the ego is worse. I think that the parent function in the ego might be the original false prophet. And the parent function in the superego is kind of like a sympathetic false prophet. But that is the one that you also have to perhaps sympathize with, that you're not, that the that's the one that has to be rehabilitated. Anyway, I don't want to elaborate into this too much, but that what I've already said interfaces quite profoundly with the commentary that I've already made on sort of my ontological model of the development of someone's psychology from the metatype perspective. Anyway, none of this relates to how metatype interfaces with Metagram. So let me make some comments about that. So the other parts of the elaboration and speculation that I wanted to mention is that I think that also what happens perhaps with narcissists is that it might be that there isn't any fixed rule as to which metagram circuit should correspond to which metatype. And I do think that it might be possible that some metatypes can literally try to imprint on themselves a metagram circuitry which just doesn't fit with their metatype. And what this would lead to is that they would have a very unbalanced working of their metagram, because they wouldn't have full vision of their own metagram circuitry. Part of it would be would be void to them. They would be acting in it or upon it in a blind way. And so I think some people might have, man, I had the word for this when I was thinking about it earlier on. I've forgotten it, but kind of a word, just basically a fundamental sort of incongruence, a fundamental, like it's just not feasible, essentially, that they have an unfeasible metagram circuitry which they're trying to use as an interface from their metatype. And because of this it's almost like a schism waiting to happen, but that there are lots of different ways in which the schism can manifest. And I think one of the ways in which the schism can manifest is that, and I think this could perhaps, isn't so. I think that some people might not have developed, because I think that the only way to have an internal locus of control is to develop it through your metagram circuitry. So with whatever identification you have made with metagram circuitry, that is usually how people are thrown into their interface with their unconscious side of the mind. That is how they frame themselves in some third person perspective, in some object. People look at themselves from the perspective of the outside. They track what they're doing from the perspective of the outside. They look at themselves through the gaze of society, through the framework of the group, or something like that, or maybe their own objective framework. They try to create their own philosophical or intellectual framework, how they see themselves through some lens that they construct, through some unconscious lens. Everyone has to develop an unconscious lens. Now, that unconscious lens will be something like your conscious awareness of your own style of interaction. To know, So metagram essentially is located within the unconsciousness in metatype. And so this is, so the part of you are a thinker, and the unconsciousness of your thinkerness of your is going to govern how you see yourself interacting with other people, and how you see yourself interacting in some kind of objective paradigm, in some, you know, it could also be called morality or meta-morality, that you have to create a moral paradigm in terms of how you operate, in terms, that is, if you care about having consistency, or care about having any kind of persistent identity, or persistent efficacy. Obviously, if you don't see yourself as having any persistent essence, characteristic, then that itself is going to be a consistent characteristic. So I don't think that you can even get away from this, because if that is going to be, if you're going to be a stochastic chaos agent of chaos, I mean, that can't even persist unless that is your conscious view of yourself, or that is the decision that you've made about how you objectively frame your own characteristic. And if you don't have the capacity to have this level of I mean, I don't think you're sentient if you don't have an unconscious side of the mind. I do think that pretty everyone living that is a human being is going to have some awareness of this, even, but it obviously, I mean, it's called the unconsciousness for a reason. This is distinct from the environmental unconsciousness, which is how I would characterize the superego. But anyway, okay, so and just by the way, I mean, I would link this to one of the three P's, to the participatory. Anyway, so the unconsciousness is the side of the mind that is the participatory, but okay, this is irrelevant. So if people identify themselves as having a style, a pattern of their own character, of how they express themselves, or the style of their own thought pattern. So this is, so people, and you can also call this, I guess, the habitual default, or at least their residual modus operandi of their participatory interaction through some kind of, lens of how they see themselves, or something like that. And it's quite ironic, because I think that people can be unconscious about their unconsciousness, but they might not say, oh yes, this is how I see myself, but they do see themselves in some way. So they will have an unconsciousness, even if they haven't consciously translated it into an articulated, sort of, delineation of their own disposition. But they do have a disposition about how they see themselves through some lens. Okay, so sorry, I'm slowing myself down here. I'm just trying to be methodical. So how I see it happening is that if someone has a metagram circuitry that perhaps they are trying to imitate, perhaps through some process like mimetic desire, or perhaps something almost like the converse of mimetic desire. Perhaps they've been traumatized or abused, and they are mimicking the stylistic interaction style of their abuser. They are imprinting Scientologists would call it the winning valence, that someone in their environment, someone in their objective framework is dominant, is powerful, has some positive characteristics. So then they try to mimic it. They try to copy it. They try to have that live through them. But if they try to emulate this metagram thing, it's not, let's say, native or organic. It hasn't organically been cultivated within their own unconscious grounding. And so what they end up doing is maybe they can emulate half of it really well, but the other half of it, they really don't have the resources. They don't. When I say that they don't have the resources, I mean that their metatype structure just so happens to have a particular layout that there's a metatype mechanical occlusion or imposition or obstacle. There's an incongruence between being able to fluidly, so there's an impediment from the metatype structural point of view of being able to integrate. So they've got extra obstacles that they have to kind of try to get these particular conduits flowing in order to mimic the metagram circuitry, but those pathways are, let's say, different. The lay of the land is different from the person that they're trying to imitate. So they can't reproduce. They can't replicate the thing that they're trying to mimic. So they have to kind of fake it, or they have to outsource it. So they are pretending, and so they have to kind of hold their breath through the part of the song that they forgot, because it's just not natural to them. So they have to just kind of make some kind of noise, but they don't actually say the words. Okay, so they're doing that with a metagram circuitry, which doesn't fit. And maybe they even have a native metagram circuitry. Maybe they do. But it's overshadowed by this mimicry project or something like that. Or maybe they don't have another metagram circuitry. Maybe they just have this one which is a bad fit for their metatype. Now, I want to say as well that I haven't done all my thinking about this, because maybe there are no fixed metagram types and metagram circuits. Maybe all of these things are all up in the air, and they just kind of naturally agglomerate and fit into some distribution that is maybe culturally relative. Or maybe it's a combination of cultural relativity and maybe like emotion, like in some societies, in some cultures, some things are feminine. In other societies and other cultures, some things are masculine. Like it's that kind of ad hoc distribution. And it's just, and it just so happens that, because the metagram circuitry is very much like Greek mythology in terms of its in terms of the archetypal it really, like, if you understand the mechanics of it, you can use it to weave stories. It's almost like a drama engine. And the classical distinction between comedy and drama, between comedy and tragedy, is that comedy is not that actually. I heard Jordan Peterson say this, that comedy is a happy story and tragedy is a sad story. But I believe that the classical distinction between comedy and tragedy is that comedy is when man decides man's fate, and tragedy is when the gods decide man's fate. And I think that, relating this to the metagram circuitry, comedy is when some agent, some antagonist or protagonist, is driving the plot. Whereas tragedy is when the plot is moved by mere circumstance and the characters are merely reacting to the unfolding of events. And essentially these events are just a kind of the the culmination and intersection of unrelated chaotic bits of sort of debris of very like butterflies flapping their wings in very distant places, uh, converging on which is perhaps another way of saying that like the plot itself or the narrative is framed in such a way so that you are given no insight, and it's almost, I think, the opposite of I guess I do in some sense think that, I mean, in some sense this is one of the secrets I think of Greek mythology, is that all of Greek mythology is none of it is tragic. It's all a comedy. Some of it is a dark comedy and some of it is a light comedy, but in some sense the underlying point of all of Greek mythology is that its hubris is the ultimate evil. That there is no, you're not being toyed by the gods in some sense. You are fumbling due to your own hubris in some sense. That might be quite an egregious oversimplification, but if I can just make that cheap point and move on. But that's a bit of a rough and dirty point. But anyway, that would actually need a lot of qualification and cleaning up. But anyway. And getting into sort of the fringe cases, which would be very interesting in trying to synthesize. But I mean, that's what religion is there for, and that's what deep moral philosophy is there for, and how do you actually fully integrate an internal locus of control? Anyway, so my idea is that, and this is also why I think that people can be very malevolent and potentially even quite evil, is because perhaps they are actualizing a metagram circuitry which they can't operate very effectively. It's just not. It's somewhat being decided by structural metatype formations, and it's a bad match. It's a bad. Anyway, that might not even be possible. It might not be possible for people to radically have incongruent metagram circuits for their own metatype. So that's just something I'm speculating, but because it really had me thinking about, very mentally sick people, and then also thinking about contrasting that or juxtaposing that against bipolar, type 1 disorder, and major manic episodes, which, many years ago I used to suffer from, that, and I do think that I haven't thought about this way too much, but I do think I'm onto something in having the metagram explanation of this, which is that the unconscious. I think that the unconscious emotional tone is the axle that the metagram circuitry develops from. So the first thing that is developed is that you develop one unconscious emotional tone, and that already kind of sets you up into what emotional tone circuitry might develop thereafter. You're kind of already typecast within some limited spectrum. And So that's the first sort of bind that is occurring within development, is the unconscious emotional tone. And in some sense, I think that the unconscious emotional tone might be the only sort of, that might be the one that I think, maybe I think that might relate to what in Scientology is referred to as the service facsimile. Um, but that, because essentially, if you can overcome that, or you can disabuse yourself from that sort of self-identification, then you might be free to access all the emotional tone circuitry without any kind of prejudice or bias, or sort of fundamental sort of kind of ionic distortion of being corralled and sort of have tendencies and play favorites between certain emotional tones that end up accentuating and strengthening those emotional tones, which are essentially representatives of preferred thought habits or thinking patterns. Uh, so those emotional tones, um, hmm, uh, it's probably also slightly different because also, well, I think that actually because if you have the unconscious emotional tone, the ego emotional tone is always a correlate of the unconscious emotional tone. It's always the opposite on the same. I don't have to get into the detail of it, but essentially, um, if if the unconscious emotional tone is a negative or a positive emotional tone, um, the ego's emotional tone will always be the particular consort of that negative or positive tone, because every negative tone has a positive tone that is always on the same line as it. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but that kind of stuff is explained in other recordings. But if you want to follow that particular thread, but which essentially means that the unconscious and the ego is kind of in a bit of a war, but also that the unconscious emotional tone is also fundamentally doesn't really represent only the unconscious side of the mind. It also represents the superego. That there is a kind of within metagram circuitry, the unconscious emotional tone does kind of represent the superego as well. So there's also that adds to the meta type complexity of trying to sort out the fundamental two tower problem between the two parent functions, which I do think is also like that's where structurally psychological issues come from. But it's kind of this must be a very confused recording to listen to, but it's just basically to make the point that the superego and the ego are together. Uh, just lost my thread because of background noise, but what was I going to say? The superego and the ego are the. I was going to say something like that. They are the beginning of Oh yeah, that they are the true cause of the problem. They are the underlying problem. But you can't just treat the problem, you also have to treat the symptoms. And so, like, that there are mechanical faults that occur on the level of metagram, and you have to kind of, so it's kind of like if you have a broken engine in a car, but it still runs in a broken way, you end up having other problems with, the car is knocking over things in the road, and you still have to pay for the damage that you've done with the car. So the problem might be the engine, but you still have to sort of fix the other damage that is being done just in the operation of the broken car. So the metagram stuff is kind of symptomatic, but it's also, the point of having a fixed engine in a car is that you're able to drive and be transported and use the roads. So it's like, the point of having a fixed engine is not so that the car is fixed, it's that you can actually go from A to B. So that's the difference between sort of metagram. You want to get from A to B, you want to use metagram, but you need to use it in an unbroken way. So, you have to recognize the damage that you've done in terms of how you've already gone off the rails. Also, because horribly this is actually a pretty good analogy though, is that, let's just elaborate the analogy slightly, is that you haven't just done damage, but you're also you haven't just not gone from A to B, but you've gone in the opposite direction. You've gone from A to C, and C is further away than A was to B. So you've made your eventual destination harder. You've made it more arduous, and so you actually have to make some kind of corrective course correction that goes beyond fixing the engine. You need to fix the engine, but you also need a navigational um, rehabilitation. And so this is why sort of the metagram model is necessary, um, to track these things. So, also to kind of find almost the ideal, but the actual thing that's causing the problem is metatype. And so metagram then becomes a much less, potentially on a lot of levels, metagram becomes a lot less useful. Well, in that it's not the be all and end all that, oh, you just, because it might even be that people can even change I don't really think that that's true, that people are, I mean, there might be some fluidity within certain some metagrams might be so unstable that they kind of oscillate between sort of two, I mean, there are even metagram circuits which themselves have a lot of uh, I don't know how to say it. They have a lot of internal fluidity. There's a kind of there are alternatives within it, but yeah, that's also a slight point of speculation for me, exactly how those alternatives pan out in practice, because I do think that some circuits naturally have a capacity to have like a double-barreled sort of, that they can have dual circuits developed or being used, which then also create other levels of complexity, or potential sort of internal incoherence, or cognitive dissonance. Um, and like, I think that there are many people who have the potential to be bipolar who never develop bipolar because they only develop one circuit, essentially. But anyway, I do think that I think I've probably found the factor that makes the difference between bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2. So my particular view is that bipolar type 1 is caused when the unconscious emotional tone is essentially because some circuits are so fully developed or capable of developing two almost completely separate circuits that two distinct circuits that the second distinct circuit tries to create its own unconscious emotional tone, which in some sense is kind of like a trap door that leads itself back into the superego. And so you can actually kind of enter a state of almost like the oceanic stage of development. Because you're going back to the point at which that you are establishing a new unconscious emotional tone, which is like a new lens or a new focal point for an objective view of your own self-identity. And so when you do that, you kind of undercut all of your, because I do think that all the emotional tone, all the metagram circuitry is essentially the stylistic arc that undergirds and collates all of the sides of the mind. It's how all the sides of the mind correspond to one another. It's kind of like the filing system, or it's the coding system. And so when you create a completely ulterior coding system, you gain the ability to kind of pick and choose or to divert or to just kind of look past the already accumulated mass of structure. And so you literally have created a new personality, or you've created a tentatively new personality or a competing personality. And that separate unconscious emotional tone maybe it's only disruptive. I mean, maybe in some sense it's always innately there as well as just as a kind of unconscious phantasm of a kind of potentiality. It's only when it actually tries to take control of the circuitry. It's when the actual circuitry tries to route itself through that unconscious circuit as opposed to the other unconscious circuits. You're kind of like formatting your hard drive, which is the same thing as deleting everything on your hard drive. You're trying to update the format of your hard drive. So you are creating a different memory matrix, or you're creating a different sort of identity matrix or objective lens through which to recapitulate your own identity. It's not just identity though; it's the actual decision tree of your own character, as it were. But sorry, there's so many things that I need to cover. So I think the thing that I have to work out is now a focus on, in metatype, the parent function, the inferior function, the child function. I think these are the three primary actors. And 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 th And it's the reason why I was talking about Paul van der Klee talking about desire and the spirituality of desire is because, I mean, this is where sin comes in. Sin happens because the desire is either not executed, as in it's not performed, it's not done, or if it is done, it has missed the mark. Either way, it's sin. And that's just a technical way of me saying that the desire is because of the non-execution of the will. Because if you will something, you desire it, but then if you don't do it, then it's sin. So you don't do the will. And there's actually, that might seem too simple to some people, but this is the difference between the will of God and the will of man, or the spirit of man and the spirit of God, is that if the only thing that can be executed is the will of God, because that is the only thing that actually has an authoritative presence in reality. It's the only thing that can be manifest. And so, in some sense, the will of man is always self-defeating. It's fundamentally sin. And this is almost, I mean, you can relate this even, alchemical philosophy even talks something of this, is that you can't, I've forgotten the exact formulation of this, but it's like you can't try to do something. Trying to do something is always like a failure. You have to conceive of it like completed in some sense, and then you are just, you're not doing it, you're letting it happen. You're facilitating the unfolding of reality. You're not controlling it. So you're an agent of something that is already in existence, that's already conceived within the faith, within the intellect. So you were just a transparent vehicle of an intellect that is not blemished by compartmentalization or is not fractured. And so, in some sense, it's the ability to be able to hold, let's say, true ideals in a sustainable way is really the only kind of spiritual thing that there is. And the real obstacle to this is, in some sense, the structure of the personality and the misunderstanding of the personality, or the misunderstanding that the personality has cottoned onto or attached itself to. And anyway, so the lack of integration between the desire and the parent function, and let's say the no man's land of the inferior function, or so I mean, just by the way, how I would equate these things in Christian scriptural terms, the parent function is representative of the enticed lust. The inferior function is representative of the trial, and the child function is actually representative of both the sin and the lust. It's the sin of the enticed lust, but it's also a new lust. And in some sense, that new lust was somewhat instigated or already starting to become framed by the trial. Because the trial, in some sense, the inferior function, which is also sometimes called the ignoring function, is the self ignorance, or the filter of salience, how you filter your own salience, how you filter your own attention to cut away the dead, to hone in on in some sense it's kind of like a cleanup after the enticed lust, because the enticed lust really tries to confuse the situation. Because in some sense the problem to the parent function is that the child function isn't good enough anymore. The lust isn't good enough anymore. Because the vanity, which I haven't even spoken about in this in these three things that I'm talking about, the vanity has come just before the parent function. And the vanity has actually worked out that you can get the lust, you can do the lust. But if you get it, you won't want it anymore. Your idea about it will have changed. So either you basically the vanity tells you that there's a cost to the lust, and the enticed lust is generated because you actually need to sweeten the deal, because now you can even get what you want, but you don't want it at that price. And so the enticed lust has to come and sweeten the deal, and to broaden the lust, and to generalize it, or to abstract it, or to kind of elaborate on it in some sense. It tries to spice it up, tries to dress it up that it's still worth chasing. It's like giving you it's like a cheerleader. The parent function is like a cheerleader in this way. It's trying to dress it up in dignity. It's trying to add an extra promise or something like that. And then the trial comes and says, because the enticed lust really makes things delusional. It really makes things more, it's surreal. The parent function has done something that actually makes things surreal. It plays with the idea of authority. It is like a false prophet. It misleads. It's like a misleading advertisement. And then the trial function is like buyer's remorse. It felt so good when you were at the mall buying the things and and the consumerism felt good. But then the day after, that's the trial. And then already, if you say, well, this isn't good enough, I don't like this, I feel bad about this now, I feel remorseful about it. Well, if you feel remorseful about it, then you already have the ingredients of what would have been good enough. Because if you feel remorseful about it, then the negative implies the positive. So the regret or the particular complaint, it already implies the outline of something that would have, in its substitute, been good. So the thing that follows the trial is the sin, which is that now you've closed that chapter. Well, if you can close that chapter on the buyer's remorse, then how you close that chapter is, in some sense, a orientation towards a new substituted ideal or value or desire. So it's kind of like to close the door on a cycle of action is in some sense already to invite a new cycle of action. Is to especially in how sin closes the cycle of action, which is in some sense that to miss the mark, you have to know the mark that was missed. So when you sin, you have a mark. as a byproduct. You have a new mark, or at least you have an image of a mark. So to sin is to have an image of, or to have, supposedly it's the same mark, but it's not the same mark actually, but supposedly it's kind of the same mark. So that's also, so you get it, you end up birthing a new child function, and then the cycle happens again. Child function, vanity, parent function, inferior function. And each of these cycles is a different side of the mind. And depending on their particular order, I don't know where exactly is worth starting from is. And the weird thing is that it all started, or if you believe what I said earlier, it all started from the ego's parent function, was the first parent function. And that grew the superego, and then the superego grew the ego more, and then the ego grew the subconscious. So the ego tells you what you have. In some sense, the superego tells you what your environment has and keeps track of your environment. And it's almost the procedure through which that all these things are framed. The ego is the I'm forgetting what the third P was. I think it's propositional. I think the ego is propositional. And then the subconscious is that's annoying. So I've messed this up before, this correspondence. Breaking my flow, but anyway. Okay, so the unconscious is participatory. Superego is procedural. Then the subconscious and the ego. I said that the ego was propositional. And the subconscious was perspectival. Yeah. Yeah, the subset of frameworks. Anyway, and so the ego is propositional, the superego is procedural. And then those two, from the ego sets up the subconscious, which is the perspectival, and then between the perspectives and the propositional, the unconscious is developed, the participatory. And when the participatory is properly grounded, then the ego can actually fully anchor itself. Because without the unconscious developing a metagram self-style image of its own style of behavioral sort of objective participation with other people, it can't well, at least when the unconscious is properly developed, then the ego can actually get into kind of iterative sort of test benching its own propositional introspection. Anyway, this is such a rank amateur recording. But yeah, you see, the fundamental problem is that within, and this really runs up into the issue of total depravity, is these three basic components: is the parent function, the inferior function, and the child function of the next side of the mind. But that those three components, and it almost makes me wonder if that's why a lot of bipolar people, bipolar type 1, get into deepening cycles of major manic episodes, because essentially they know that there's something wrong about metatype. They know that there's something wrong about their metatype, and there's something monotonous about their metagram circuitry, and they want to transcend it, but instead of actually solving the problem of their metagram circuitry, they just try to kind of escape from it internally, because they know that there's something fundamentally wrong about it. That there's a monotonous seesaw between the parent function, the inferior function, and the child function. That there's an internal and they just kind of have a structural way out of it, and so that they think that that is the way to escape, or that is the way, that would be the sort of the highest spiritual path, or something like that. And in some sense, it's probably metagram that turns them off, because to sustain your metagram circuitry, I would say that you even have to consciously sin in order to preserve your own metagram circuitry, at least one that hasn't been detached from, one where you haven't been able to work out at which point it's worth it tackling. Because I do think that you might be able to essentially disengage from the unconscious emotional tone, which would then perhaps free up your whole use of all the emotional tones without a kind of circuit that you are bound to, although you would still have your metatype to contend with on some level, but at least you that could be a kind of private spiritual battle to some degree, or that could be at least that could be confronted in a separate manner. To I don't think you have to contend with metagram and metatype simultaneously. You could at least finish with metagram and focus on finishing up metatype. You probably can't do the converse, although technically it might be possible, but realistically it's probably very unlikely that you can fix your metatype problem and not, because if you fix your metatype problem but you're an idiot when it comes to metagram circuitry and stuff like that, I don't see how that's even sustainable, because you're just going to confuse yourself to such a degree that maybe it is. I'll have to think about it. Maybe it is possible within certain circumstances, within certain. There would be a fundamental lack of integrity. Uh, that's maybe a wrong way of phrasing it. It would be like saying that you've invented an artificial intelligence that is just as intelligent as a human being, and then when it tries to communicate, and it says the wrong word half the time, but actually you're not lying when you say this. It's no, the problem is not the AI. The problem is just that when it interfaces with the lexicon, with the dictionary, it the program that lets it like locate the word, it is actually capable of finding the right word, but that mechanism is faulty. That particular sub program is very bad, and so it's actually choosing words based on uh, sort of bugs in that coding that is throwing off the word selection. But it's actually not the intelligence's fault, but it's just it can't translate into, so if you understand if you've solved your metatype but you haven't solved your metagram, or you don't understand metagram circuitry, um, there's a almost a lack of experiential wisdom that is going to mean that it's not going to be possible to be moral. I mean, I guess you could learn about it very quickly. That's, I think, and that's not, if you didn't have a if your metagram was properly sorted out, you could probably just, through observation and through diligent, kind of concerted um, study, self study, and just keen awareness and tracking things, you could probably get a metagram model in some sense. It's interesting, my metagram model, I mean, that could be used as some level of confirmation, because as a philosophy machine, as an experiential wisdom machine, if it works, because it really does have a lot of mechanics attached to it that it kind of delineates. So, if those seem to be quite deep and coherent, and in their complexity, that might itself be an independent confirmatory kind of indication. Anyway, I'm babbling. Uh, Let me stop this recording. Yeah, I need to think more about parent functions and Fourier functions and child functions. And I also, I need to make a recording about metagram. At least the dynamics of metagram, because that'll be interesting. I mean, I guess I haven't tried to teach anyone about it, but I have made very delicate, very intricate diagrams on it. So I should try to present that, because that will either show me as being a charlatan or a fraud, or show that there is a lot of valuable things in my psychological models that can teach things that are valuable to know. Um, okay. There are three minor issues which I should probably mention, because they were part of sort of the package of bundled concepts that I just wanted to, I guess, have connected with what I've already spoken about. The one thing is that this is still perhaps too tentative. I haven't thought about this deeply enough. But the reason why I brought up the Paul van der Klee sort of desire thing, which has come from recently, Paul van der Klee talking about High on God, which is a book that he keeps on bringing up on this topic. But it's an interesting sort of, I don't know, I'm kind of riffing off a kind of a theme that I see in some of my own thinking, which is also represented in the topics that he's been talking about recently, which is this kind of, this almost oscillation or vacillation between the kind of you almost get like two different types, very roughly speaking, two different stereotypes of people giving sermons. That you get the ones, this is a very sort of rough stereotype. You get the ones that try to convict people, that try to impel people towards developing a judgment, a kind of a more, to sort of to harangue them for their inconsistent beliefs, to shine a light on the kind of the fundamental weaknesses, but also to kind of to almost do like a fault testing, to sort of to try to, and this, this can work. This can be a useful spiritual tool, but it often doesn't work if people are accustomed to, let's say, not having the humility and the patience of of in some sense, you need a certain kind of temerity as well for you to not take that kind of inspiration badly. Because, if you don't, you know, everything can be taken out of context. Everything also has its own fundamental limits within the subtext, or at least within some level of context in which it's pertinent, and some level of context which is going to overstep its own thesis, because nothing, you can't make a complete communication. You have to kind of contextualize it with some kind of understanding. And if you don't, the point of education often is to impart understanding. And so, because of the imperfection and also, that you can't exhaustively communicate about something, you, in any kind of pedagogy, there requires a kind of a two-way communication. And, obviously, if you've just been condemned, or you've just been fault tested, or you've just been kind of been given a sharp edged, kind of thing to contemplate, which doesn't sit easily with your modus operandi. It doesn't sort of, it looms heavily over something that it's judging, you know. So it does require perhaps quite a strong spiritual culture already in order to grow from that kind of interaction or that kind of engagement, because you really have to try to animate the judgment that is being extolled at you. You have to make it your own. And in trying to animate it within your own consciousness and trying to emulate it, or in terms of actually trying to think it through and incorporate it and integrate it, then you're going to see all the places where it doesn't integrate, and then you can talk about it or raise those as special concerns, and maybe you will actually be proving the theme of the thesis, but that you haven't fully cottoned on to, that you haven't fully digested it yet. So, but you have to have the temerity to perhaps to do that anyway, to have the humility to put yourself through that in some sense. And so, being able to run with it, to work with it, as it were, but then also perhaps maybe the teaching is completely misappropriated in your particular circumstance. So, the two-way communication is certainly necessary or very important. And so there's a kind of risk attached to that kind of engagement, or that kind of, let's say, spiritual edification. It requires a certain dynamism, and I mean, you can certainly. I think that there's no getting around this. I think that this is part of spiritual education. I don't think there's no easy way around this. And if you want to look at the perfect example in the Christian example, look at Jesus. I mean, how many times did he rebuke his own apostles and disciples? There's no getting around it. And in some sense, the authenticity of that, the grittiness of that, the visceral engagement of that is vitally necessary to have an authentic spiritual understanding. And I don't think that there's a way around that. But anyway, so perhaps I've shown my hand already. So there's that element in spiritual education, let's just say, or spiritual teaching. And there are forms of diplomacy, and there are obviously artful and tactful ways of explaining something so as to minimize, let's just say, confusion and misunderstanding. I mean, there are better and worse ways, perhaps, of providing this kind of edification. But sometimes also directness and the fluidity of an authentic exchange can also be a very, very, very proficient way of accelerating a process that would otherwise just be drawn out for what vanity. And so there's a conditioning in this which I think can even be another spiritual fruit, another spiritual thing that's worth being added to, or whatever. Anyway, so you have that, and I do think that that kind of thing in some, I mean, so you have the desire that someone's affirmation, someone's motivation, someone's their will, uh, their volition, their desire needs to be conditioned, and it somewhat needs to be conditioned by judgment and understanding. Perhaps it needs to enslave itself to an understanding that actually has integrity, that actually is justified in its understanding, and trying to work towards that justified understanding. Proper substantiation, not excuses and consolation, as in like a sympathetic intellectual system of conferring some kind of meted out condemnation for not being justified and not having proper substantiation and living in sin, which is what anyway. But so just going back to my parent function, inferior function, child function, I think that the parent function somewhat can be on the. See, this is the problem, is that when we are trying to integrate something, we're trying to integrate something into our parent function, but the parent function is also the enticed lust, and the mediating thing between the parent function and the child function is the trial. So you need a clean trial. You need a transparent trial. You start to develop an inferior function, an ignoring function that doesn't hone in its salience, that doesn't hone in its attention conveniently. So these are the things that I think are being refined in some sense, and in some sense, the sin and the lust, the desire, the child function, is all those things, needs to be the volitional aspect, the value aspect, the mark, what you're striving towards. The teleos, the purpose, I think is kind of in the child function. And then you have the judgment, the structure, the understanding, which is somewhat the so I think that there's the parent function and there's the child function. And we are our own parents and we are our own child in this way. And we have to grow the parents and we have to grow the child, and we have to integrate this, and we also have to integrate it in in the conduit that links the two, the trial. And these things have to, I mean, I haven't thought about this too deeply, but I mean, this is why I think that, just trying to hone your desire, be high, or sorry, the name of the book, I've just lost the name of the book. Is it High on God or something? I think that, trying to purify the child function or something like that, or regiment the child function into a stable affirmative reward loop, or whatever you want to call it, I think that that is itself an ensnaring, and a kind of, that is the spiritual journey run aground, in some sense, that's stuck in a rut. I think that it's a kind of, that becomes itself chasing the dragon, as it were. Um, Whereas the parent function and the trial function, these things are much more dark. These things are much more burdensome and heavy, as it were. But these, I think, are the sharp instruments that, the sword that cuts both ways. Um, Iron sharpening iron, those sorts of things. That's, and it's, I mean, this is also one of the huge diversions of our time, is that, the sort of the desire, the child function, obviously, the desire of the flesh, as it were. you know I think if you care about, wanting to desire knowledge of God, and being a servant of God, that, you see, and this sounds completely disjointed, because what I'm about to say could almost be uttered in an atheistic sort of framework, is that you need to have a justified understanding. And I mean, in 1 John chapter 5, it says explicitly that the Son of God has come and hath given us an understanding, and the life is in the Son. And it says, and this is eternal life and God. It says, and this is God and eternal life. The understanding is God and eternal life. This is right near the end of 1 John chapter 5. It explains away God in that sense. You can reduce it to how your parent function is navigating metagram circuitry. How the structure of your parent function. And I do really think that it is all about changing the character of the parent function to not, it needs to become a true prophet rather than a false prophet. That is essentially the kind, that's I think, in the most simple mechanical terms, that's sort of where the key is, the key to death in Hades. In Revelations, it also says explicitly, and the mystery of God shall be finished. The life is in the Son. And and the Son says that he does the will of the Father. And if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So what is he talking about? He's talking about his understanding. The understanding of the spiritual truth. And a full integration into spiritual interface with reality, or one's life experience, or whatever, however you want to frame it, in the subjective or some kind of objective lens. But And so, obviously there's a gradient scale probably of how to educate people, because obviously if you just kind of give them hell and brimstone, also a lot of that stuff, a lot of people that have these fiery sermons, I don't think that you can judge these sermons based on how much they want to convict people of certain things. I think you just base their quality of the sermon on how much understanding is there, how much actionable understanding, how much real psychotechnology is being accessible to the person who's receiving the sermon. Are they actually being taught something? Are they actually growing in their ability to access things? So it's sort of is the lesson being learnt essentially, or is it just a kind of? Because a lot of the very fiery stuff, there's nothing actionable there. There's nothing relatable or understandable there. It's just a. But I mean, this is also sometimes how understanding. I mean, it's an art in some sense, because you can't make somebody else understand something. An explanation is not an understanding. An explanation somewhat has to be reverse engineered. It has to be performed, devised by the person who is receiving the signal, as it were. They have to duplicate uh, the framing, the construction. Uh, and in some sense, all of that duplication is under the auspices of a particular named spirit that will have that particular constellation of how one construes one's or interfaces with one's psychology or reality or behavior or whatever, in terms of how one actuates one's will. That will be, I mean, that will be under a particular style, a particular way of doing things, and that particular way will be the way of a particular spirit. And until you start naming these spirits, until you start discerning the names of the spirits, and when I say the name, I don't mean that you have to give it a label or call it something. You just have to, I mean, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it X spirit, Y spirit, Z spirit. You just know that there are these different ways. These are all the different ways that they are. And I've tested all these different ways. It doesn't matter what you call them. Naming it just means how you know it. Discerning the spirits. Try the spirits whether they are of God. Try them out in your mind. Don't do them. Contemplate doing them. Contemplate actualizing them. Contemplate seeing the world through that perspective, through that framework, through that lens. That is how you name it. Going through how you've actualized it or emulated actualizing it. Then you've discerned the spirit. And then there's going to be some spirit that I guess can navigate the now, I mean, the problem with the false ego complex or with metatype is that, there are a lot of things happening at the same time. And if you probably, and you have to, at some point, you have to resolve one thing, or you have to resolve one thing at a time, essentially. So there needs to be a particular sequence or a procedure, or at least a focal point, or understanding what is secondary and what is tertiary and what is primary in terms of the layers of the onion to be unraveled and resolved. And I'm thinking that fundamentally it's kind of like I've described it as the two towers between the parent function of the superego and the parent function of the ego. And there is quite almost an existential metaphysical conundrum that is, and I said also that I would explain that what I referred to in earlier recordings as a trifecta, which I did kind of, and I almost want to repeat it, but it's not going to be probably any better than how I mentioned it before. So this is not a proper explanation, but I'm sure that there is. I haven't been able to find it. It's annoyed me, but I know that within alchemical hermetic alchemy, there is. It's almost like an early logician's. There's a kind of a logical kind of. I think they're called terrible trifecta, or that you get unperfected trifecta and perfected trifecta, and you have to sort of perfect in order to resolve a trifecta, because that's the problem with trifectas, is that they they perpetuate themselves in a kind of in a almost sort of in a tangle, almost similar to like the Mobius sort of tangle, but in a much more trifectas. I think usually end up in a kind of sort of pentagram, probably, in because they end up creating dilemmas on dilemmas of groups of dilemmas, and you end up with sort of 5 different ways of looking at the problem, but they're all fundamentally, they all contain trapdoors into other dilemmas, which end up sort of cycling back in an infernal sort of insoluble tangle. And I do think that there's something about the two tower problem, the two parent functions, that fundamentally is a trifecta. That between the parent function of the ego and the parent function of the superego, that is creating that is creating a trifecta. Although so I'd have to work out what the third point is there, because that's only 2 points. It's probably the sin of the ego is the death is yeah, it's incongruent to the other sides of the mind. It's not the same as the other sides of the mind. That the sin of the ego is it's almost as if the ego almost has two inferior functions, because the ego has its inferior function, and then it almost has another inferior function in it almost has two inferior functions in a row. The sin almost being the second one, because the sin is usually the lust of the next side of the mind. But the sin of the ego is not the child function of the superego, which is usually the case in other sides of the mind. So the inferior function and the sin are almost relative to the superego. They kind of conflate almost, that they both are like the inferior function. And the child function of the superego, I still don't know what to think about it or how to deal with it, because I've generally considered that it is perhaps falls into one of the days of in the grave, in that Jesus Christ spends 3 days in the grave before resurrecting. And I've thought that that might correspond with the sin of the ego, the child function of the superego, and the dominant function. of the superego and then is resurrected on the third day. So he's resurrected on the day of the dominant function in the superego, and then that becomes the New Jerusalem, and then the parent function of the superego gets rehabilitated as the tree of life, which is contained within the New Jerusalem. And essentially Christ being archetypally the inferior function, the ignoring function in the ego that takes on the burden of the sin of the world, the environmental sin. So it takes upon itself, in some sense, the desire of the world. The child function of the superego gets burdened by the inferior function of the ego. But what's missing in that story is what happens to the parent function of the ego, which I've already described earlier as the whore of Babylon. Is that obviously in Revelations it's described as being repaid double for the iniquity. So that the parent function of the ego has to sort of be really cut down to size and regarded as the author of, the abominations in the earth. The name of blasphemy. Really is where all the impetus of all the sin of the false ego complex, I think, comes from. It's from the ego's parent function. But where does... And in some sense it is also operating as a false prophet. But where does that impetus actually come from? I mean, in some sense I would say that it comes from the vanity, the dominant function, but in some sense that's only a very secondary, supporting, subsidiary consort. Dominant function is like the Babylon the Great itself, the rich kings and merchants that do fornication and are drunk on the wrath from the fornication with the whore. But in some sense I think it's mainly empowered by the inferior function of the unconscious, which set up the child function of the ego, which is essentially the ostensible power that the false prophet presides thereafter. So it's the false image of the desire. But in some sense, because it already operated before that, but that is the pretext of the internal coherence of the false ego complex, is that, kind of epistemologically it's prior to the child function of the ego, but ontologically it already occurred without it already started operating. So what can you say about that? See, that confusion is part of the trifecta, probably, sort of confusion. At some point I'm going to have to lay this out in a much more rigorous methodological structure. And there might also be variants of this in terms of the different gunas, in terms of the sequence of how the trifecta sort of formulates itself. Let me think. The inferior function does have to happen for the child function to come about as the epistemological precondition for the parent function, and for the inferior function to operate, the parent function just before that has to already occur. So the unconscious parent function has to also be in operation, and then that requires a child function, which requires an inferior function, which requires a parent function, and then that requires a child function, which requires an inferior function, which requires a parent function. So it can either go that way of development, from the ego through the unconscious to the subconscious. All these things could operate somewhat simultaneously, that you could have the ego's parent function epistemologically setting up a chain of development into the unconscious, into the subconscious, but then simultaneously, perhaps even, or independently, you can have the superego's parent function inculcating a subconscious child function. Because, I mean, obviously the superego itself has an inferior function, which it doesn't even bother too much about, because it doesn't really care too much about its own inferior function. It doesn't hurt it that much. Because in some sense I think that the superego perhaps knows that it's just it can control the framework of reality so well, because it has such a procedural control over things, that it can it actually likes having an inferior function and a sin, because it uses that to puppet the subconscious. It uses that to kind of, that's always been my conjecture about it, I guess. But because in some sense, between the superego's inferior function and sin, that is the sin of the superego is the child function of the subconscious. And so there is this kind of systemic tension between, which is probably first felt in the subconscious, this tug of war between the two towers, between the superego's parent function that leads to the subconscious child function being interfered with by perhaps the subconscious parent function, which has been epistemologically backwards engineered from the, let's say, preferences or interests of the ego's parent function. So the ego's parent function and the superego's parent function are in a kind of dance for supremacy, even though the one is fundamentally more powerful than the other, which is another way of saying that, let me use the matrix analogy, the parent functions, the ego's parent function is maybe, that would be like the computer world, and the superego's parent function is like Zion in the real world, the free city of Zion. And I haven't seen the new Matrix film, or it's not out in my country, but I think it's only out in December. But I mean, one of the plots, the meta plots could essentially be is that there's no such thing as escaping the Matrix. There's no such thing as escaping, or at least the meta type model. That all you can do is you can wake up in a new Matrix. That when you think that you're being unplugged from the one Matrix, you're just being transported to a new environmental format. It kind of comes down to the old man talking to Neo about the machines and not making any points. What's the point of making points but just saying interesting things? And maybe he was in the Matrix, he just wasn't in a Matrix. Well, he was still in the Matrix, but he was born in, the old man was born in Zion. He was, I think, the oldest human being born outside the Matrix. And he therefore could never see the Matrix because he didn't have a port at the back of his head to plug into it. So within that world, some people that he knew that was taken from the Matrix could plug back into the Matrix. But he was born outside of one of those pods, so he could never get into the Matrix. So if he was still in a Matrix, he was in a Matrix that in which he was not able to interface. He was not able to enter into the Matrix within the Matrix. So in some sense, or I'm preluding that maybe the plot of the next Matrix film is that when Neo escaped from the Matrix, he didn't escape from the Matrix. He just escaped from the Matrix within the Matrix. And in some sense it's relevant, and the old man that was talking to him, it didn't make a difference. Because he was still in the Matrix. It was just, in some sense, the whole political mission, or the whole revolutionary mission, was just to try to get people into a lower a lower level of inception, to get everyone escaped from the matrix within a matrix. But then, obviously the thing is that when you escape from a matrix, what's there to prove that you've ever been fully ejected or unincepted? What is the criteria that you would even look for? And in some sense, the only criteria that you could look for is the criteria within yourself. I mean, this is why, a lot of people that talk about the simulation hypothesis about, that life is just a simulation. Well, if you get into some levels of spiritual philosophy, it's like, it's irrelevant because it's all holographic anyway. It's in the sense that it's a hologram of your internal integrity and morality. That's the stuff that really matters anyway. Anyway, this just a way of me somewhat giving some strange analogy to the thing that these two parent functions, these two towers, they might have, in their tug of war, they might have created all manner of incongruence and internal tension and cognitive dissonance, but in their own mediation between the two, or hopeful resolution between the two, that they're not going to rely on an external locus of control. They're just going to stop generating a plethora of sort of a mirrotric paradox of seeing infinity when they're just seeing themselves reflected in one another, and the tension between one another. And I had radically speculated that the child function of the superego could essentially be potentially the kernel of a new personality that would be a unitary kind of force, but I also think that might also be the antithesis of the real solution, because that could be very dangerous, because that could actually be the image of the beast, exactly, the actual conditioned environmental unconscious conditioning unified into some kind of solitary volitional but it's also, even if you tried to focus on the child function, it wouldn't stop there, because it would be not just the child function, it would be the child function and the dominant function in the superego, which I've already said that the dominant function, I believe, is the New Jerusalem. But then the question is it possible to have a dominant function without a child function? And this is the thing. I think that the point might be to develop the dominant function, or to fortify it, that is maybe the lens of transparent sanity, of clarity, through which one can navigate the tug of war trespassing of the two towers against one another. Which might even in some sense imply the rehabilitation of the child function. But if one tries to do it from the level of the child function, then you're going to sort of perhaps bias the dominant function. I wonder. I know, I have a very strong intuition that the child function is dangerous in some way if it's not treated carefully, but maybe I should test it out. The superego child function. Just developing the superego child function. Or trying to perfect it, perhaps. Whenever I imagine trying to develop the superego child function, it just ends up feeling hollow to me, in that it's very close to bringing coherence and a kind of unitary sense of integrity, but it seems that it's an overshoot of something. Feels like it's overshooting the inferior function of the ego, which has already been damaged. Maybe that's it. You take the child function of the superego and you use that to punish the parent function of the ego. Maybe that is the formula, is that you try to get some kind of reconciliation or resolution in terms of, maybe that's just the missing procedure that I have overlooked or skipped out on, that you take the parent function in the ego and you attenuate it by the uneasiness of trying to hone and actualize and make prominent the superego's child function, because that is in some sense that is perhaps something like the primal hurt. That is the primal hurt that is the damage held within the environmental unconsciousness, which is kind of fueling the ego's parent function to instigate and establish itself. And also to allow the superego's parent function to be overactive, because of this kind of sort of primal hurt. So yeah, I did say earlier that the parent function somehow in the superego is the one that needs to be sympathized with, but not the parent function of the ego. But that it's the inferior function in the ego that needs to be essentially empowered, and it actually holds the sort of the map to salvation and the rubric of holistic integration is sort of all contained within the sentiments and the sensibility of the inferior function of the ego. That's where sort of all the accounting of all the buried bodies lies. But but also the inferior function has to be willing to take on that burden. And to count the dead, as it were. Okay, so yeah, I think that's a general theory of self-actualization from Metatype. still doesn't leave me with a very satisfactory connection with how Metagram interfaces with that. Oh my word. Metagram, I think, is pretty much in tatters at this point. I need to, you see, there's a problem. I need to experiment on people. Or I need case studies. I need personality profiles. I need psychometry. Okay. Anyway. Okay, this is somewhat of a continuation. I made a long recording, which I might not upload because it has a lot of embarrassing. The format of the content is very poorly presented, and I mean, well, it's very long. Maybe I will release it just for completeness sake, but it's got a lot of flab. It's a lot of hollow bulk in some sense, or I was thinking things through as a lot of these recordings are like. Anyway, a lot of it was tentative and speculative before. I still haven't fully recounted the formula of my grouping of my metagram groupings and how that corresponds with metatype. But in the long recording that I made essentially a whole lot of you could call it concessions in some sense, but I kind of already pronounced judgment on my entire experiment. And in terms of the confirmation that I was looking for, I said that basically it's a failed experiment because I was essentially trying to find an uncanny correspondence that would essentially prove a level of internal consistency that would be sort of, at least it would offer some kind of confirmatory kind of internal congruence or something like that. And then I unpicked the philosophical pretension in that whole way of testing it. And I basically, I mean, and I almost made the concession that, well, this proves that either I'm I'm a charlatan of the highest degree, or that but essentially the kind of confirmation that I was seeking towards was never predestined to be available, even if all my models are correct. And I specifically drew out the and I drew out some of the speculations that I've always had, that there might be fixed correspondences between metatype and metagram, but the idea that they don't actually exactly plug into one another, that they aren't in a cohesive alignment with one another, that there are only certain kinds of correspondences that have to sort of be bridged through making the whole system hang together in a more philosophical or metaphysical kind of rounded out structure, might be a necessary sophistication. It might be, and so, and that, and this even drew me into outlining what that framework was, which is essentially distinguishing the thinker and the thought, the actor and the performance, or the player and the play, as it were. And in some sense, and because this is all about modeling cognition, this is all about modeling thoughts, But, and this is the complexity, is that you need to have a model of the thinker and you need to have a model of the thought. And both of those things together make up thinking. So to understand thinking, you have to understand the thinker and the thought. And then you have to understand that the thought will have some kind of reference or model of the thinker within its own ambit. And the thinker will have to have in some sense, the thinker doesn't have a model of thoughts, but it will have a kind of metaphysical a priori substructure, or it'll have a certain fundamental sort of framework. And so there's going to be some kind of intersection between the two, and it's going to be complicated. But the idea that there was going to be sort of a complete alignment and dovetail between these two things, instead of just something of a almost haphazard intersection, in that there are going to be some things that are interrelatable, but other things that kind of don't have fixed translations, that there might be fixed correspondences, but there's going to be a kind of gap, that these things aren't going to seamlessly meld together. And I'm recapping it now, but I probably did a better philosophical outline of pontificating about this thinker and thought kind of, that it's right and proper that that these are two separate models, and it can be justified why they don't fully marry up with one another. Now, in further, and this led me to the admission that there's a lot of things about Metagram that I don't fully understand, and that, in always trying to drive towards an integration between the two models, I always just kept speculating about Metagram, and I never quite I don't want to say things incorrectly, phrase them too incorrectly. How thoughts flow, how cognition operates, the circuits of that, I do believe that I have a fixed model of that. But there is an operator that's operating the flow of this thinking. And that operator is essentially what metatype is dealing with. And so you have to understand both in conjunction in some sense. And when I say both in conjunction, not in conjunction with each other, but in terms of their distinct separate operations and mechanics, and then how they would how they might simultaneously manifest. But there is no unified model, essentially. But that doesn't mean that within Metagram there aren't sub sorry, I can't think of the right word, but sort of sub-categorical frameworks, or different subject matter, or different ways of breaking up the field of Metagram, and then understanding the metatype compartment of how the metatype impresses itself upon the functioning of those things, in the different aspects of Metagram. So and this also leads to a whole lot of other weird things, because in some sense, you kind of have to play with this to understand it, I think. And in playing with it, the best way to kind of explain it is to and to showcase these kinds of mechanics, and sort of how they come together. And I must say, I don't have a full picture of it myself. I've just been working on a part of it, which I think is really starting to give a lot of bones and structure to the kind of to the whole sort of thing. But in really getting a taste of the total functional awareness that it provides, it almost requires you to misspeak and to kind of talk a bit of gobbledygook, or a kind, because essentially, so sort of trying to express how it would function in practice. And this obviously leans heavily on something like the more ordinary uh, um, developmental, sort of the more commonplace um, types of things. So when I get into describing these things, I'm going to be using a lot of sort of stereotypes, and or in some sense I'm going to sort of say, oh, well, this is early life, this is maturity, this is this is functioning maturity, or sort of adults development of the false ego complex. But when you're fundamentally talking about something that is, I call it the false ego complex, it's fundamentally factitious, but it's also because it's the picture that is formed by two incongruent models. And sorry, this is much easier if I just start talking about specifics. So within Metagram itself, and within each Metagram type, they are essentially two independent circuits. And these two independent circuits only interact with one another via the medium of metatype. So Metagram itself is being mediated by metatype constraints and structure. And so there is a seamless function in practice and functioning. These things operate simultaneously, but you can't model them. And in some sense, the metagram is always a consequence of metatype. But if metagram is operating within some regularity or some ordinary, unfettered, or sort of unimpeded, or sort of within some kind of ideal operating condition of sort of getting its way, there is some variability within even that definition, because it's kind of like it's kind of like lightning. It's going to take the path of least resistance, and that is going to be, let's say, contextualized by the current sort of environmental opportunity costs and sort of particular lay of the land, as it were. So it's like, but that doesn't change that lightning has sort of that you can kind of understand it through conductivity and through charge, and you can measure it, and all these sorts of things. But sort of the reason why it's taking why there's one sort of lightning arc instead of another, in terms of its actual pathway, in some sense, is going to be based on the thinker, the operator, the metatype content. And the kinds of feedback between these two things is just updating your view of the context or the environmental, kind of particularization of metagram, and it will increase, kind of preponderances of possibility or whatever. It'll change the sort of the statistical distribution in terms of metagram, but it's not determined by metagram. You could say that it's perhaps determined by the susceptibility that the metatype structure has to conditioning itself to maintaining a regular metagram expression. So anyway, and in some sense, the metatype affinity or association, or the kind of the imprint that the metatype has taken onto the metagram. So, like proper self-actualization, I would say that all comes from metatype. It doesn't come from metagram, but in some sense, you do have to have a kind of experiential wisdom, I would say, of being familiar enough with the mechanics of metagram in order to navigate the tumultuous seas of, whatever, karma or the flesh or, the world. Okay, so, and I think that at some point I'm going to have to sort of take a break from developing this integrated model, because it's still a kind of integrated model, even though I've kind of admitted that there's a fundamental incongruence, and in some sense that is tracked within metagram itself, that there are sort of two circuits which only interrelate with one another or can correspond with one another through the bridge of metatype. And so in some sense, I think metatype can somewhat be co-opted by metagram, and that would be probably the source of most pathology. I mean, I think in Scientology, sort of the phrase of this would be that people become a slave to energy, to mental energy, which is also, that's quite a common, I think, perhaps even Hinduism and Buddhism, would kind of understand as well that kind of concept, that sort of people, I think in Buddhism is called sort of monkey mind, perhaps. But essentially not having the mastery over the mind means that then you are enslaved by tracing the line of thinking, and always finding that one line of thinking leads to another line of thinking, and you're just kind of imprinted by some kind of procession. And then perhaps the whole point of metagram in some sense is that metagram doesn't track mental objects, but the mental objects that I'm talking about when I talk about metagram are cognitive spins. They're styles of cognition. They are stylistic content. So that's what I'm referring to when I say mental objects, or thoughts, is that I'm not talking about the actual I'm talking about a kind of investment into the mental object, or a kind of what the mental object is colored by, or how it is the grammar that constructs it within my model of cognitive functions, which are almost like sort of the palette of things that we can construct mental objects out of. And so that is how I track the drama that the mind is fundamentally situated within. Anyway, okay, so one of the things that I get to in my much too long recording is trying to reduce metatype into the bare bones, which are the salient features that correspond or interact with metagram. And it's very complicated, because metagram and metatype already I had a model of how they intersected in some sense, but trying to actually create some kind of cogent narrative around that is because there are a lot of moving parts. It's a very complicated structure, and which also, in fully hashing this out will be the treasure of understanding every kind of psychopathology, every kind of sort of mental illness or insanity or discombobulation or whatever, any kind of breakdown or disintegration or lack of development will find some some kind of point of reference within that kind of unified narrative. And as I say again, that unified narrative is going to be, this really requires a kind of so I'm kind of at the limit of my ability to further carry on my own research to some degree, probably because at some point I'm going to have to integrate this with clinical symptoms and clinical observation and categories of psychopathology. So, but I think I'm very much familiar with narcissism and borderline personality disorder, which are essentially the cluster B personality disorders, and I think that those are extreme enough cases that look, I mean, I know that sort of the cluster A personality disorders are perhaps quite different from the cluster B, but I think that if I can if I can sort of categorize all the cluster Bs, then the cluster A will probably find itself present within the model along some similar line. Anyway, okay. And in any case, I think that my models will eventually, if slightly better borne out and developed and presented, will perhaps be a very, very useful tool for aiding people in self-knowledge, self-actualization, kind of like a much better blueprint of Enneagram and typology and MBTI and socionics, a much better system than all of those systems. So anyway, that's sort of the purpose that I'm working towards. Okay, so if I go towards... Okay, so the model, let's just say the most relevant, so I find the need to, and I was kind of inspired to do this by listening to Paul van der Klee, and he was talking about this book, High on God, and he was talking about two interesting topics. He was talking about sort of how marriage equality within the Protestant church is kind of leading to its death, is something, or how marriage equality means the death for Protestant churches. Very interesting, which this is a kind of a perennial, this kind of sophisticated thesis, I think, exemplifies, especially in the thesis of how he talked about it, it exemplifies, to my mind, a perennial sort of metaphysical issue. And although this is going to be quite abstractly, perhaps distinct from what he was talking about in that particular video, thematically, I think it's kind of in the same ballpark, although it's a different issue. There are two types of characters of preacher or sermon or priest in terms of a spiritual teaching that is provided. there are two types of almost very, very. This is a very large generalization, and the one thing is something like the fire and brimstone convicting you of some structure of framing for judging things, for, you could say, being a more distinguished thinker or discerner, almost inviting you to update your judgment on things. And a lot of people, just to get this, I don't even want to talk about this, but a lot of people, I think, incorrectly say that Christianity is not about judging things, or it's against judging things. This is not actually true. The scripture says, "Judge not, yes, lest ye be judged." It doesn't say do not judge. It says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Just says that judgment is a two-sided blade, cuts both ways. That's all that means. Doesn't say don't judge. And in fact, the Spirit of the Lord is the Spirit of knowledge and understanding and judgment. So, and the discerning spirit, I mean, discerning is a synonym for judgment, as discrimination is a synonym for thought or thinking. And there are lots of mention in the scripture of the mind of Christ. The conscience is mentioned. Doctrine is mentioned. All of these things are impossible without thought and judgment and wisdom. Anyway, so and I mean, Jesus himself rebuked his own disciples constantly, almost constantly threatening them. I mean, in some sense, not threatening, but implicitly, in some sense, you could say that he was. I mean, you could perhaps even say that on some occasions his disciples were too concessionary, because they made concessions before they even knew what they should be conceding to. And, in some sense, schism was always threatened against them, in terms of the escalation of their rebuke. Because in some sense, and this is my point about the fire and brimstone convicting you of things, way of teaching, spiritual teaching, is that you need to develop a certain kind of temerity, a certain kind of gritty honesty, in some sense, in order to grow from that kind of instruction. Because you can't just you can't just imbibe it uncritically. And if you're going to digest it critically, so that it becomes a part of you, that you assimilate it into your judgment, then you're going to perhaps ask stupid questions, maybe, or questions which prove that you didn't get the point entirely. But that's the point of asking clarifying questions. So you can kind of be ousting yourself as a an even worse kind of reprobate. But if you don't have the kind of the patience and the humility to kind of to sort of have the mentality of the iron sharpening iron, if you don't have that kind of commitment, and you instead of just have a kind of faux kind of humility, that you're not willing to allow yourself to crystallize your own position so that it's capable of being corrected, sort of the difference, I mean, in Buddhism they talk about the cup that is already half full or whatever, or that you have to have an empty cup before it can be filled up. But I think that perhaps the lukewarm analogy is a bit better. At communicating the level at which people are not capable of getting anywhere close to examining their own spiritual condition, as it were, or confronting it in a direct and sort of honest way. But and all of this I would link to the parent function in Myers-Briggs, or within my model, the parent function. And then you have the inferior function, which in my model has relays to other parent functions. And the inferior function is also sometimes called the ignoring function. And I do think that it's also the function that relates to salience. And in some sense, when you are already trying to trim the fat, if you're already trying to focus in on something that is salient after you have, it means that your judgment itself, just prior to curtailing what is salient about it, means that it's not really an actionable judgment. It's a bit excessive in some sense. And the inferior function is in some sense also the trial of the lust, of the desire, of the prior desire, and it already is a reimagining of a new desire. It is the conditioning of your judgment that leads towards a new motivational framework, a new. Sorry, I'm slightly jumping around here. The other type of teaching that a spiritual teacher might do is, or worship as it's called, I guess, or that a spiritual congregation maybe in some kind of Protestant or even perhaps Catholic ethos, probably much more in terms of the Protestant, is, sort of this indulgence in worship, which is in some sense, I've seen this linked to Paul van der Klee mentioning, that this is Jonathan Piaget's, Jonathan Peugeot's. Sorry, I'm probably very bad at these names, and I just mixed up his name with Jordan Peterson's. Sort of mentor, but anyway. That the attention and that the motivation, the desire, and this is also what Paul van der Klee is bringing out from this book, High on God. Anyway, this stuff is not that important, but anyway, I link that motivation, desire stuff actually to the child function, which I also correspond, or I call it the lust. Now, perhaps these labels that I have for these things are a bit too pejorative, but I would say that people's child functions are themselves, they have an innate corruption built within them, and the only thing that can fix that corruption in some sense is having an improved judgment, is the kind of the fire and brimstone stuff, perhaps. So trying to sort of temper the fire and brimstone stuff into some kind of proper perfection and formulation of sort of the mystery of Christ, or the sacred secret, and sort of and proper doctrine and all those sorts of things. Okay, so and the process of this is I think I can explain it quite well within my model between the ego and the superego. where the parent function of the ego, the inferior function of the ego, which is a kind of in a strange position because the inferior function of the ego is kind of includes the sin of the ego as well. It's a bit asymmetrical in that sense. All the other sides of the mind, they have a distinct inferior function and they have a distinct sin, and the sin is also the child function of the preceding side of the mind. Whereas the sin of the ego is not the child function of the superego. So the sin of the ego and the inferior function somehow are both almost an inferior function strewn out over two separate cognitive functions, two separate dimensions of psychological reality. And then the child function within the superego is what I would call unipolar, because it doesn't have this input from the preceding side of the mind. It exists as a kind of unipole independent structure, and that is the fuel of the God of the world, which is administered by the false prophet, which is the parent function of the superego. Although this is somewhat confusing, but I also think that the parent function of the ego could also very much be called the false prophet. And it's actually the parent function in the superego that one must actually be more sympathetic to and rehabilitate, because that rehabilitated is the tree of life. And in some sense, the thing that is controlling the whole personality, the whole false ego, is the child function in the superego. It is the sole source of power and fuel. And it is seeing that source of power and motivation in the myriad cognitive dissonance of seeing, because this essentially breaks down into two power structures, into the ego's parent function and the superego's parent function. The superego's parent function, a really good analogy for this is the first set of Matrix movies, and I really hope that the next Matrix movies don't screw up my use of these analogies. That you can, there's a way of looking at the Matrix movies as that it is essentially a wrestling match between the archetype, the architect and the oracle, and they're in opposition with one another. Like, this is how the Matrix organically operates the false ego complex. If you take the analogy that the Matrix is the false ego complex, is that the architect is somewhat more the architect doesn't exist inside the Matrix, although you can get to him through a special door. But he's not. He's almost a man in the sky. He's a man in the clouds in some sense. He just watches from above. He's got all these little screens all over the place, and what he's watching is he's watching the one, because the one is the glitch in his Matrix. Is the resistance inside the Matrix to his model. And in some sense, the architect is much more part of the plan of the architect is Zion, is essentially a controlled opposition. So, the architect is very much correspondent with Zion within the real world, supposedly. So Zion and the architect are kind of on the same bent, as it were. And then the one and the oracle, or the oracle lives in the Matrix. The oracle is also a machine, but she's kind of playing chess against the architect. She's trying to break the model. She's trying to, she's part of the resistance, but she doesn't see Zion. She doesn't see, she doesn't leave the Matrix. She's a computer program. But she is trying to bring it down. She wants a real revolution. So the architect and Zion are part of the program for the controlled resistance, but inside the program, inside the Matrix, is the oracle, and she really does want revolution. And in some sense, that the tension between these two forces is the recurring drama that makes the whole model sustainable in some sense. That is the tension that allows for the thing to perpetuate itself, because this is what is going to create the perturbations of drama, the propitiation, but in some sense they are all centered on the same unipolar theme, which is the child function of the superego, that they both have a preferential claim to represent perhaps the source of the child function. Now, I would say that it is true that the oracle has a secondary claim to it. Her claim is more distant, because the architect had to set up the structure first before the oracle could exist within that structure, in some sense. Or I think it's also implied that she helped design it, or and that's also, sorry, the reason why I'm talking like this is because it does actually perfectly match up with my model. Perhaps I should explain how that is so. But so basically, in this analogy, the superego parent function is the architect, and the unconscious parent function is the oracle. And basically is that the parent function ends up creating a child function on the next side of the mind, because it is the judgment of the parent function that, through the filter of the inferior function, the ignoring function, ends up transmutating whatever hasn't been absorbed by the filter of the inferior function, ends up becoming the framework of the new child function. So the judgment sows a seed, and whatever isn't washed away by the inferior function, whatever salience is not sort of, however it's, whatever part of that judgment is left undenuded, becomes the new child function of the next side of the mind. The new child function of the next side of the mind is, in some sense, the mandate or the scope that charges the preceding parent function. So the unconscious parent function is creating the child function for the ego, which I've already said is the false prophet. So this is the whole question of the matrix in my analogy of psychology: is the one a false prophet? Is the latest Neo a false prophet? And this is somewhat measured against the ability of the inferior function of the ego. And in some sense, I think what essentially has to happen, I believe, is that the child function of the superego, that unipolar force, has to, in some sense, be anticipated by the inferior function of the ego, and in some sense by the sin of the ego, which is also burdened by the inferior function of the ego. The inferior function of the ego has to integrate these two things, both the child function of the superego and the sin of the ego. And both of these things have to be used to fight the parent function of the ego and cut it down to size. And with the parent function of the ego properly diminished, and I think this is what is being described when the whore of Babylon is being paid double for her for her iniquity is that the parent function of the superego starts to rehabilitate or rejuvenate into the tree of life, essentially. And then the child function in the subconscious, which is essentially propagated through the parent function of the superego, is capable of being purified to the extent that the subconscious parent function can, in a kind of chain reaction, be unadulterated. And this involves, in some sense, perhaps all, I should say that this is slightly speculative, but detaching the parent function of the subconscious imprint or projection of an emotional tone on the superego's inferior function, so that the filter between the superego parent function and the subconscious child function is reconfigured. And also the subconscious parent function is also contributing to the inferior function of the unconscious. But it isn't the only thing that is setting up those inferior function filters and emotional tones. It's also the parent function in the ego is also contributing to those things. It's weird because, in some sense, each inferior function is being contributed to by 3 different parent functions. One of them through, in some sense, through metatype, and 2 of them through metagram. Yeah, I'll have to make diagrams of this and talk about it when I make my big presentation. When I get all my pictures ready. I probably also have to try to start trying to catalog metagram mechanics, which are very hard to confidently sort of be aware of, because it's sort of this is really like an alchemical sort of in investigation, and quite sadly, it's this itself is what makes psychology really a fundamentally treacherous kind of field, is that you can, sadly, I think there's really no way of getting around it. You have to have your hunches, you just have to kind of frame it as speculation, and try to see what is all the ways of explaining what seems to be happening until somebody else can come up with a better model. But I do think that I have outlined, or at least discovered, all the constituent parts, and now it's just merely arranging them into but yeah, the actual interaction between the parent function and the inferior function that has an emotional tone projected onto it or imprinted on it by the parent function, these are perhaps conduits which themselves might be prone to being hijacked or being augmented, that people might essentially there might also be sort of detours that one can make on these lines, and so in some sense they are hooks waiting to be adorned with somebody else's commingling, or so yeah. I mean, then there might be sort of that people might be okay with substituting these conduits in some sense if they're just taken on a slight detour in which they have to take a longer route to get to the same sort of thing. But they would probably also find that taxing on their own psyche. But this might also be a mechanic of how people take energy from one another, or a kind of it might be a property of Metagram in terms of how people siphon mental energy from one another, how sort of there's a kind of karmic agitation anyway. But just getting back to the Paul van der Klee thing, so I mean, I do think that there's this sort of perennial thing between motivation and judgment. And I mean, this might seem like too much of a simplification, but, and I mean, it certainly is even within my own system, but I think it makes sense in terms of modeling the stuff to leave out the dominant function. Because you can just kind of, you can go from the child function to the parent function, and you can just kind of overlook the dominant function in terms of just seeing the dominant function as being taking on a particular character, or taking on a particular role or charge or performance that is somewhat corralled by these other more prominent actors or roles that are happening within the meta-type cognition. That the dominant function, the reason why the dominant function is so strong is because it's fundamentally untethered. It's kind of, it is the proverbial fat that is being trimmed by the parent function. But because it's able to indulge freely, it can actually have a much more astute and clear view of things. It's just that view of things is often well, it's taxing to the motivational structure. It's sort of it's irrelevant to the actual business of conducting the false ego complex, or it can add complications to the business of having a regulated false ego complex. So the dominant function in terms of the actual structure of the false ego complex is essentially it represents, perhaps if it represents anything, it represents a holiday when the dominant function is being indulged in parent functions used to be called, or still are. I mean, it can also be called. They used to call the child function the stress function. I mean, the parent function is also called the creative function, but I do think that that creativity is sometimes also a kind of it's creative in the aspect that it's priming the child function of the next side of the mind. Perhaps this would have been a lot more interesting if I had actually stated what my own parent functions are and my own child functions are in the various sides of the mind, because that would give some people a view as to creating a much more robust sort of example and image to think about. But anyway, I'll try to do this but yeah, let me just mention some other things that I've been thinking about. So I think narcissists, again, I mean, I've said this before, I think narcissists have a problem in their subconscious. I think the reason why the narcissist isn't a person, why there's nobody home, is because their subconscious is has never been properly developed. And so in some sense they have a developed ego with an undeveloped subconscious. And I think borderlines actually do have a developed subconscious. It's just they have, so I think borderline is a problem of the ego, which ends up creating subconscious pathological structures, or it ends up manifesting subconscious pathological symptoms. And in some sense, this, I do need to center everything on something. This thought that I have is that one is only capable of setting up an ego and a subconscious once the unconscious is already started, or at least the unconscious parent function has already started through metatype producing an ego child function. So I'm probably going to end up with a much more complicated ontological model of the development of the false ego complex that then is going to sort of be schismatically interjected with sort of metagram speculation, but also possible metagram sort of filler breaks in the ontological narrative, which are filled in um, by the range of metagram developmental correlates. And obviously those things will probably be a kind of an uncodified, list. It's not going to be complete. So anyway, that's what I'm working on at the moment, and I mean, it looks much better in the diagram that I'm staring at while I'm talking, which sadly, isn't being shared in this recording right now, but, unless I can make better diagrams and put it on. It's going to look like quite a confusing diagram with all of this at once, I guess. But yeah, I'm going to make a big presentation, which models a lot of this stuff out. Okay.